Months, 112. Month, 1 Foundations. The Scholam Psychana. Novus rose from the ruins of what had been an execution ground, where once pyres burned psychers for the crime of existence now. Training halls stretched toward Terra's poison skis. Karen had overseen construction with typical Mechanicus efficiency, 72 hours from Imperial decree to functional facility, prefabricated modules blessed by grudging ecclesiarchs monitored by servo skulls from 3 different agencies. Madara stood at the Scholam center courtyard, watching the first class arrive. 200 psychers. Younger than his first group, the Imperium had decided to start with those who hadn't yet been scheduled for the throne. Children mostly. Teenagers whose powers had just manifested. Adults whose mutations had been caught early. They came in chains. "Old habits die hard," Inquisitor Voss said, appearing beside him. She'd been assigned as primary inquisitorial liaison, a role she claimed to hate, but pursued with meticulous dedication. "Will you remove them?" Madara asked, not taking his eyes off the arriving prisoners. "Eventually, when the Arbites are convinced they won't bolt, when the ecclesiarchy stops demanding they be burned, when—" She paused. "When we prove this isn't a mistake." Madara's Rinnegan tracked each face: terror, resignation, confused hope. So much like his first group, so much like every child soldier he'd sent to die in the Warring States period. "It won't be a mistake," he said quietly, "but it will be difficult." The chains were removed 3 days later after the first successful network formation without a single psyker attempting escape or violence. The Arbites had been shocked. Madara had not. People who are treated like people tend to act like people. Revolutionary concept. Lyra had become his primary assistant, the first graduate of his methods, now teaching others. Her white hair had become a symbol proof that you could push to your limits and survive. That sacrifice didn't require death. She stood before the new students in the main hall, silver thread woven through her braids, voice steady. 6 weeks ago, I was scheduled to die, to burn as fuel for a god who never asked if I wanted to. Today, I teach you how to live, how to contribute without being consumed, how to choose your fate instead of having it chosen for you. A girl near the front, no older than 12, with eyes that glowed faintly blue, raised her hand. "They say you fought demons, that you banished demon princes." "We did," Lyra confirmed. 71 of us working together, not because we were forced to, because we chose to. "Can you teach us to do that?" Lyra smiled. "That's exactly what we're here for." The training began simply. Meditation, breathing, physical awareness. The same fundamentals Madara had taught his first group, now systematized into curriculum by Karen's analysis. Chakra generation follows biological patterns. Karen explained to a class of 200, his vocalizer broadcasting across the hall, while servo skulls recorded everything. Cellular energy conversion plus consciousness direction equals measurable output. Mechanicus has designated this biopsychic synthesis inefficient term, but adequate. He pulled up a hololithic display showing energy pathways through a human body. Traditional psyker draws power from warp, external, unstable, corruptible. Entity 998's method generates power internally stable, reproducible, chaos-resistant. Imperium's standard doctrine required revision. We are revising. The admission cost him. Madara could see it in the minute fluctuations of Karen's optical lenses. The Mechanicus didn't revise doctrine lightly, but they revised it for results, and the results were undeniable. By month's end, 43% of the new students had achieved basic chakra manipulation. Slower than his first group, but that group had been desperate and facing imminent death. These students had hope. Hope made them careful. Careful was slower, but more stable. Madara walked through the training halls at night when most students slept, but some practiced alone or in small groups, generating small flames of colored light, learning to feel power that was truly theirs. A young man sat in meditation, barely 16, with skin that shimmered like oil on water. He opened his eyes as Madara approached. "I can feel it," he said, wonder in his voice. "The energy. It's warm, not burning, not consuming, just warm." "That's life," Madara said. "The energy of being alive. Psychers have always had it. You were just never taught to recognize it as separate from the warp. Why not? Why didn't the Imperium teach us this? Madara considered lying, softening it. But these people deserve truth. Because the Imperium needs fuel, and fuel doesn't need to understand what it burns for. You are more useful dead than empowered. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. But that's changing. Slowly. Because you're choosing to make it change. The boy, his name was Tarek, returned to meditation. But Madara saw the determination in his posture, saw the moment someone stopped being a victim and became a participant in their own story. This is what I never gave my own people. The choice to be more than tools. Month 3. Resistance. The first major attack came not from chaos, but from within. A coordinated strike by redemptionist fanatics cult members who believed the Emperor's suffering was holy and any attempt to ease it was damnation. They had smuggled themselves into the Sholam's lower levels, disguised as maintenance servitors. 20 cultists, armed with autoguns and holy fire, screaming prayers as they opened fire on a class of 50 young psychers. The response was immediate and devastating. Lyra's network, practiced now to near instinct, snapped into formation in under 3 seconds. 50 psychers, children and teenagers, barely trained, formed a defensive barrier of pure psychic force. Not warp-based, chakra solidified, reality made tangible through collective will. The bullets stopped, hung in midair, fell harmlessly to the ground. Kalis and his Grey Knights arrived 30 seconds later to find the cultists on their knees weeping, trapped in a genjutsu that showed them the faces of every psyker they'd tried to kill, not as monsters, as children, as people. We didn't mean, one cultist stammered. They're supposed to be abominations. They're students, Kalis said coldly, binding them in consecrated chains. And you just attacked children under Imperial protection. You'll answer to the Inquisition. Madara arrived last, having felt the disturbance through his permanent connection to the primary network. He found Lyra at the center of the defensive formation, silver fire still blazing in her eyes, breathing hard but standing firm. "Everyone all right?" he asked. "Tarek took a graze," she reported. "Minor. Medici are treating him. Everyone else unharmed. The network held." "Good. Release it now." Carefully. The barrier dissolved. The cultists were led away. The students stood in shocked silence, processing what had just happened. They had been attacked, they had defended themselves, and they had done it without killing anyone. That, Madara addressed them, is the difference between power and control. Power says, "I can destroy you." Control says, "I don't have to." He gestured at the fallen bullets. "You were seconds away from death. You could have lashed out, burned them, killed them all. Instead, you protected yourselves and subdued them. That's not weakness. That's strength." A girl near the back, her skin covered in crystalline growth, spoke up. "They wanted to kill us. Don't they deserve?" "Deserve." Madara's voice was sharp. "I once believed people deserved what I decided they deserved, that I could judge who lived and died based on my vision of justice." He looked at each of them. "I was wrong. And that wrongness killed millions. Don't make my mistakes." The girl lowered her eyes, but she was thinking. They all were. That night, Inquisitor Voss filed a report with the High Lords. One paragraph stood out. Psychers under Madara's instruction demonstrated defensive protocols exceeding standard, sanctioned psycher response. 0 casualties, 0 corruption, minimal collateral damage. Recommend expanded training programs across segmentum. The High Lords read it. Some approved, others raged, but the numbers spoke for themselves. The Skolam was working. Month 5. Expansion. The second facility opened on Mars. The Mechanicus had been watching, recording, analyzing, and they'd reached a conclusion that would have been heresy 6 months ago. Madara's methods could be systematized, taught, replicated. Karen led the Martian project personally, a converted manufactorum redesigned to train psychers in chakra techniques, while Mechanicus Genitors studied the biological mechanisms. Understanding breeds optimization. Karen transmitted to Madara via encrypted noospheric link. If chakra generation follows biological patterns, biological enhancement should increase output. Request permission to begin augmentation trials. Denied, Madara replied immediately. This isn't technology to be optimized. It's people learning to live with themselves. But efficiency gains are irrelevant if they cost humanity. The whole point is that these psychers remain human. Augmentation risks losing that. Silence on the link. Then, acknowledged. Mechanicus adjusts approach. We'll focus on training methodology optimization instead of biological modification. It was a compromise. Karen wanted to study the power. Madara wanted to preserve the people. They met in the middle, improved the teaching without changing the students. The Martian facility graduated its first class in month 7. 60 psychers trained by tech priests under Lyra's supervision successfully formed networks without a single corruption incident. The Fabricator General of Mars issued a statement that rippled through the Mechanicus. The Omniscia's knowledge is vast, but even the machine gods faithful must acknowledge when new understanding emerges. This cooperation may represent previously undiscovered principles of bioelectric harmony, worthy of study, worthy of implementation. Translation: Mars officially supported the program. With Mechanicus backing 3 more facilities opened across the segmentum solar: Luna, Titan, Ganymede. Each one training psychers in techniques that 6 months ago would have been declared heretical. By month 8, over 1,000 psychers had been trained in chakra manipulation. By month 9, the first permanent networks were established, groups of 50 to 100 psychers, maintaining sustained beacons in synchronization with the Astronomicon. The Imperium's navigators began reporting something unprecedented. They could choose which beacon to follow. The Astronomicon for stability and power. The chakra networks for clarity and corruption resistance. It wasn't replacement yet, but it was redundancy. And in a galaxy where the loss of the Astronomicon meant humanity's extinction, redundancy was salvation. Month 7. The price of progress. Not everyone survived. Adept Corin, 23 years old, had been one of the most promising students. Natural talent, quick to learn, generous in spirit, always helping others master techniques he'd grasped immediately. During an advanced synchronization exercise, his connection to the network destabilized. Not from external attack, not from corruption, just failure. A feedback loop his instructors couldn't break fast enough. He burned out in 17 seconds. They found his body still in meditation pose, chakra pathways charred beyond recognition, eyes open and empty. He hadn't suffered. The overload had destroyed his nervous system too quickly for pain. That didn't make it better. Madara ordered the entire Skolam into assembly. All 200 students, all instructors, everyone who had known Corin. His name was Adept Corin, Madara said, standing before the gathered psychers with the boy's body laid out in honor. He was 23. He liked poetry, especially the old Terran verses. He was kind, he was brave, and he died because I'm teaching you something dangerous. Silence. Absolute silence. I told you this system was safer than the Golden Throne, and it is statistically demonstrably safer, but it is not perfectly safe. It cannot be. Power always carries risk, and I will not lie to you about that. He looked at each face. Corin chose to be here, chose to train, chose to push himself in service of something he believed in, and that choice cost him his life. If any of you wish to leave, wish to go back to the old way where your fate is decided by others, I will not stop you. No shame, no judgment, just choice. No one moved. Lyra stepped forward. We've all been scheduled to die, all of us in this room. The difference is Kreen died trying to be something more, died choosing his path. That matters. Tarek joined her. He taught me how to stabilize my second chakra gate. Spent 3 hours with me when he could have been advancing his own training. He was good. One by one, students shared memories. The old man who'd been in Madara's first group spoke of Corin's laughter. The crystalline girl talked about his patience. A boy with shadow manipulation powers wept openly. When the ceremony ended, Madara carved Corin's name into the Skolam's memorial wall. The first entry in what he knew wouldn't be the last. That night, Voss found him standing before the wall, Rinnegan reflecting moonlight. "One death," she said, "versus the 1,000 who would have died in the same period under the old system. Statistically, statistics don't mourn," Madara interrupted. "His friends do, his instructors do, I do. You've killed thousands. Why does this one matter? Because I chose to be responsible for these lives. Not to use them, but to teach them. When your student dies, even from accident, you carry it." He traced Korin's name on the wall. "And you remember that power without cost is a lie told by people who've never paid it." Voss was quiet. "Then, the Imperium doesn't teach that. We teach that sacrifice is glorious, that death in service is the highest honor." Maybe that's what needs to change. Maybe honor isn't found in dying well, but in living carefully, in acknowledging that every life lost is a failure, even when it's necessary, even when it's accidental. The moment you stop mourning casualties is the moment you become what you're fighting against. He turned away from the wall. Korin will not be the last death, but he will be mourned, and that has to mean something. Month 10, the Deep Warp Incursion. The Chaos Gods had been patient, watching, learning, adapting. For 10 months, they'd held back, letting Madara build his networks, train his psychers, establish redundancy, letting the Imperium grow, dependent on these new beacons, because dependent meant vulnerable. The attack came from within the warp itself, not at real space, but at the metaphysical connection between the chakra networks and the immaterium. If they couldn't corrupt the power source, they'd corrupt the projection. On Mars, a network of 70 psychers suddenly screamed in unison. Their beacon stable for 3 months began to twist, purple-red light bleeding to crimson, to black, shapes forming in the energy that should not exist in ordered space. "Corruption detected!" Karen's alarm shrieked across all channels. "Warp entities infiltrating network architecture vector unknown. Recommend immediate shutdown." But if they shut down, 70 psychers in deep synchronization would experience catastrophic feedback. Probable death toll total. Madara felt it the moment it began through his permanent connection to all networks, through the psychic resonance that let him monitor every trained psyker in the system. He teleported directly to Mars via Kamui, materializing in the center of the corrupted network. What he saw was nightmare made manifest. The psychers were still in formation, still channeling power, but their chakra was being twisted in real time. Not by possession, none of them were corrupted at the individual level, but the connections between them, the flows of energy that made the network function, were being infiltrated by something that existed between dimensions. Madara's Rinnegan tracked the source, a rift not in real space, but in the conceptual space where chakra and warp overlapped. Where his power projected into the immaterium to create a beacon, the Chaos Gods had found a back door. Clever. They can't corrupt the source, so they corrupt the transmission. "Lyra," he transmitted across all channels, "get everyone to Mars, now. We need to reinforce this network or it collapses and takes these people with it. On our way." But Mars was 3 hours from Terra, even with fastest transport. The network wouldn't last 20 minutes. Madara made a decision he'd sworn not to make. He connected directly to the network, not as coordinator but as participant, pouring his own chakra into the system, reinforcing the connections, burning his own reserves to buy time. The corruption pushed back. He felt entities on the other side, not full gods, but fragments, echoes, lesser demons empowered beyond their station, armed with understanding of his techniques gained from months of observation. They whispered in his mind, "You think yourself separate from the warp, you project into it. And in the warp, we are law. Your order cannot stand against our chaos, not here, not in our domain." "You're right," Madara admitted, still channeling power, still holding the network together. "In your domain, you are supreme. Good thing I'm not fighting you there." His Rinnegan blazed. Shinra Tensei. Not outward, inward. He compressed the network's projection point, made it smaller, denser, harder to infiltrate. Less a beacon spreading across the warp and more a needle piercing through it. Minimal surface area for corruption. The demonic entities shrieked as their infiltration vectors collapsed. The network stabilized. But Madara was burning fast, too fast. 3 hours was too long. Then Lyra's voice. "We're here." 40 psychers from Terra's Skolum materialized via teleportarium, Lyra at their head, not waiting for analysis, not questioning. Just forming their own network and linking to Madara's, adding their strength to his. Then more arrived. Students from Titan, from Luna, from Ganymede, networks that should have been training, dropping everything to reinforce Mars. Hundreds of connections flowing into one embattled node. The Chaos entities couldn't adapt fast enough. They'd planned for one network strong but isolated. They hadn't planned for a network of networks, for redundancy that could be summoned across a solar system. The corruption was purged in a wave of collective will. Mars beacon stabilized. The Psychers collapsed, exhausted but alive. And Madara, who'd held the line alone for 17 minutes, finally let himself fall. Kalis caught him before he hit the ground. "You almost died," the Grey Knight said. Again. "Part of the job," Madara managed Rinnegan, flickering. "Teaching sometimes means standing between your students and disaster. Hashirama would be proud." Madara looked at him in surprise. The Grey Knight smiled slightly. "You talk about him sometimes, in your sleep when you think no one's listening. Your friend, the one you betrayed and spent your existence trying to honor." Madara closed his eyes. "I'm not sure pride is what he'd feel. More like resigned disappointment that I'm still throwing myself into danger for redemption I'll never actually achieve." "Maybe." Kalis helped him to his feet. "Or maybe he'd say that failing to protect people you've chosen to teach isn't redemption. It's just being a decent person, and you don't need to die for that." Around them, Psychers were hugging, crying, celebrating survival. Networks that had never met in person had just saved each other's lives through pure coordination, through trust, through the very thing Madara had tried to teach. Karen approached his mechadendrites, twitching with what might have been approval. Chaos infiltration repelled through distributed redundancy. Network of networks architecture proves superior to isolated node model. Recommend immediate implementation across all training facilities. Meaning, Voss asked, having arrived with the Terra contingent, meaning the Chaos gods just taught us how to make this system perfect. By trying to break one network, they proved that connected networks cannot be broken. We've achieved true redundancy. Karen's optical lenses focused on Madara. Entity 998 has demonstrated that human cooperation properly structured defeats even divine malevolence. Madara laughed, hoarse, exhausted, but genuine. Don't tell the Emperor. His ego couldn't take knowing random Psychers cooperating are stronger than his solo godhood. But the joke fell flat when Voss's Vox crackled with an incoming transmission direct from the Golden Throne. The Emperor's voice carrying across light years. "I heard it all, and I am not offended. I am vindicated. This is what I failed to build. What I should have built from the beginning. Proceed with network integration, expand training, establish protocols, and know that for the first time in 10,000 years." A pause, then somehow warmth. "I am proud of my species." The transmission ended. In the silence that followed, Lyra started crying. Then others, then dozens. Psychers who'd been told their entire lives they were defective, dangerous, disposable, hearing the God Emperor himself express pride in their achievement. Madara watched them and felt something break inside his chest. Not pain. Release. This is what it could have been. If I'd trusted people instead of controlling them. If I'd believed in their potential instead of my vision. But he hadn't. And an entire world had paid the price. These people won't, because they're choosing differently. Because I'm teaching them what I learned too late. Month 12, the final week. The year passed faster than Madara expected. 1 year of teaching, building, watching 200 students become 2,000, watching the Imperium slowly, painfully, reluctantly learn that Psychers could be partners instead of fuel. 7 days remained before his departure. The Skolam held a graduation ceremony, the first class to complete full training, ready to establish independent networks across the Imperium. Lyra stood at the podium, no longer a student but a teacher, her white hair a badge of honor. "We are the first," she told 500 gathered psychers. Not the first to have power, not the first to be feared, but the first to be trusted, to be taught that we are people first, psychers second, that our value is not in dying well, but in living better. She looked at Madara sitting in the audience beside Kalis and Voss and Karen. Our teacher gave us 1 year to prove humanity could evolve, could grow beyond sacrifice, could build something that didn't require gods or corpses. Her voice strengthened. We proved it, not him, us. He only showed us the door. We walked through it, and now, she turned back to the students. Now we hold it open for others. The ceremony continued. Graduations, awards, acknowledgements. But Madara's mind was elsewhere, already moving toward departure, toward the moment he'd leave these people to their own choices. That night, his final night on Terra, he received 3 visitors. First, Inquisitor Voss. The networks are stable, she reported all business as always. 6 major hubs, 43 minor nodes, 2,800 trained psychers, redundancy sufficient to maintain beacons even if 3 major hubs fail simultaneously. You've done it. Actually done it. They've done it, Madara corrected. Semantics. She pulled out a data slate. The High Lords have authorized full implementation. Over the next decade, we'll transition 30% of astronomican load to chakra networks. The Emperor will still bear most of the burden that much power can't be replicated quickly. But for the first time in 10,000 years, he's not alone. She paused. I was wrong about you. I thought you were a threat. Turns out, you were just someone who'd made mistakes and wanted others not to repeat them. I'm still a threat, Madara said. Just a controlled one. Give me a reason to return and I'd burn this world to ash. But you won't give me that reason, because you're choosing differently too. She smiled slightly. Don't come back. We'll handle it from here. I know. Second Kalis. The Grey Knight captain came in full armor, but with his helmet off, a gesture of respect and trust. My faith broke because of you, he said without preamble. I questioned the Emperor, questioned doctrine, questioned 10,000 years of certainty. Do you know what that does to a Grey Knight? Destroys you, Madara said. Or makes you stronger. Which was it? Both. Kalis sat. I requested reassignment to Network Protection Detail. The Imperium's creating a new Grey Knight specialization warriors dedicated to guarding the chakra networks from chaos infiltration. I've been named First Captain. Madara raised an eyebrow. You're protecting the heresy you tried to kill. I'm protecting people who deserve protection. There's a difference. He leaned forward. You taught me that. Not everyone who threatens the status quo is an enemy. Sometimes they're just someone brave enough to ask if we could do better. And can you... We're trying. That's more than we've done in millennia. Kalis stood. Thank you for not killing me when you could have, for showing mercy to someone who showed you none. Thank Matthias, Madara said. He's the one who kept questioning. I just gave him permission to ask. I will, every day, until I die. They shook hands, warrior to warrior, teacher to student, and Kalis left. Third Lyra. She came last at midnight when the Skolem was quiet, found Madara on the observation deck looking up at stars he'd soon travel between. I don't want you to go, she said. I know. We need you. The networks are stable now, but what about next year, 10 years, a century? What happens when we face something we can't handle? You handle it together. Madara turned to face her. That's the point. I'm not supposed to be the answer. You are. All of you. Cooperating, adapting, learning. But you're the founder, the first teacher. I should leave before you become dependent on me, before I become what the Emperor became, a crutch you can't walk without. His voice softened. Lyra, you held a network against demon princes. You pushed output to over 200% and survived. You taught 500 people what I taught you. You don't need me anymore. But what if I want you here anyway? The question hung between them. Not student to teacher, something more complicated. Madara's expression was gentle. Then I'd stay. And in 10 years, you'd resent me for it, because you'd look back and realize you could have been more done, more become more if I'd let you stand on your own. He placed a hand on her shoulder. You were scheduled to die 1 year ago. You're alive because you chose to trust a stranger. Now I'm asking you to trust yourself, to trust the people you've taught, to build something that lasts beyond me, beyond the Emperor, beyond any single point of failure. Tears streaked down her face. I'm scared. What if we fail? What if chaos breaks through? What if then you fail and you learn and you adapt? That's what being alive means, not succeeding always, but trying despite risk. He smiled. Besides, you won't be alone. You'll have 2,000 trained psychers, the Mechanicus, the Inquisition. Even some of the custodes actually like you now. That's more support than I ever had. She laughed through tears. You really think we can do this? I know you can, because I've watched you do it for a year. He let his hand drop. Goodbye, Lyra. Lead well, choose wisely, and remember, the strongest power is not what you hold alone, but what you share with others. She hugged him, sudden, fierce, desperate. He returned at this girl who'd become a leader, this student who'd become a teacher. When she left, Madara stood alone on the observation deck, watching Terra's light sprawl to the horizon. 1 year. He'd given them 1 year, and they'd taken it and built something I never could. Good. Departure day. The ship was unmarked, a fast courier vessel provided by the Mechanicus, outfitted with the latest warp drives and enough supplies to reach the eastern fringe without resupply. No official records, no manifests. As far as the Imperium was concerned, Entity 998 Madara would simply disappear, preferred by all parties. Madara stood at the boarding ramp, a single bag over his shoulder containing nothing but a data slate with student records and a piece of Korin's poetry scavenged from his quarters, the only memorial Madara would carry. Voss was there to see him off. Kalis, Karen, Lyra, and her first 100 students. Even Shield Captain Valoris representing the Custodes in their stiff gold-armored silence. The Emperor wishes me to convey his gratitude, Valoris said formally, for 1 year of service, for knowledge that may save the Imperium, for reminding him and us that humanity's strength lies not in suffering, but in cooperation. Madara inclined his head. Tell him I hope he finds rest someday, but not yet. Not until you've proven you can survive without him. We will. Valoris actually smiled, barely visible, but there. Because of what you taught us. The data slate in Madara's hand chimed an incoming transmission. He checked it, surprised. From the Golden Throne itself. Text only. The Emperor could have spoken directly, but he'd chosen this more personal, more human. You came to Terra by accident. You stayed by choice. You taught by compassion. And now you leave by wisdom. Knowing when to step away is harder than knowing when to step forward. I have learned from you, Madara Uchiha. Perhaps more than you learned from me. Go in peace, and know that humanity will remember the man who showed us we could be more than slaves to our own suffering. Thank you. The Emperor of Mankind. Madara stared at the message for a long moment. Then he looked up at the gathered assembly, at faces he'd taught, fought beside, bled for, mourned with. I came to your universe broken, he said, a failure who died learning the worst lesson of my life, that power without trust is just tyranny. I didn't expect to teach that lesson to you, didn't expect to find people willing to learn it, but you did, and you've become something I never could. He looked at Lyra specifically. You've become proof that people who choose each other are stronger than gods who stand alone. He turned toward the ship, stopped, looked back one last time. Don't fuck it up. Lyra laughed through tears. We won't. Good. Madara Uchiha walked up the boarding ramp, the doors sealed, the engines engaged, and the ship lifted off from Terra, rising through layers of pollution and orbital platforms, and the psychic weight of billions who would never know his name. And the warp navigators watched as the ship accelerated, watched as it passed the Astronomican's golden glow, watched as it passed the newer, smaller beacons, purple-red lights that marked where psychers had chosen cooperation over consumption. And in that moment, Navigator Octavia, who'd been the first to see Madara's beacon, sent a message across the Imperium, not words, but a pulse of respect. A salute to the anomaly who'd taught humanity a new way to be human. The ship received it, though Madara never acknowledged, just kept flying toward the edge of the system, toward the jump point that would take him out of Imperial space forever. Behind him, Terra's lights faded to a distant glow. Behind him, 2,000 psychers continued training. Behind him, networks hummed with collective power. Behind him, an empire that had run on sacrifice for 10,000 years learned slowly and painfully to run on choice. And ahead of him, freedom. The freedom to wander a galaxy that no longer needed him. The freedom to finally let go. Hashirama, he thought, I think I finally understand what you meant. About letting go. About trusting others to carry forward, about knowing when your time is done. Took me dying and being reborn in another universe, but I got there. Better late than never. The ship reached the Mandeville point and translated into the warp. Purple-red light flared one final time, his own chakra igniting briefly as the ship pierced the barrier between dimensions, then vanished into the roiling madness of the Imperium. Terra watched him go, and then turned back to the work of learning to live without gods. 6 months later, the Golden Throne Chamber was different now. Not physically, the machinery still hummed its eternal song, the cables still fed into the Emperor's withered form, the psychic pressure still made breathing difficult. But something fundamental had changed. The number of psychers feeding the Astronomicon had decreased, not dramatically from 1,000 daily to 700. But that 300 difference represented 300 lives not consumed, 300 souls diverted to the chakra networks instead. And the Astronomicon burned no less bright. Inquisitor Voss stood in the observation gallery reviewing reports. 6 months since Madara's departure, 6 months of networks operating independently. The data was remarkable. 0 corruption incidents in primary networks, 4 minor destabilizations all resolved through redundancy protocols, 2 deaths from training accidents tragic but statistically inevitable. Corrin's name had been joined by 2 others on memorial walls, but 600 lives saved from the Golden Throne. 600 psychers who would have died now living, contributing, teaching. The mathematics were undeniable. At current trajectory, within 5 years, 50% of the Astronomicon's load would transfer to chakra networks. Within 20 years, 75%. The Emperor would still be necessary. His power was too vast to fully replace, but he would no longer be alone. Acceptable progress. Magos Karen transmitted, appearing beside her. Network efficiency increasing monthly. Psyker survival rates exceeding projections, Mechanicus pleased with results. The ecclesiarchy isn't, Voss noted. High Deacon Severus and his faction had been fighting the network since day one, calling them heresy, demanding reversion to old ways. They tried to sabotage the Luna network last week. Saboteurs identified and purged, Luna network undamaged, ecclesiastical resistance diminishing as results become undeniable. Karen's mechadendrites twitched. Even faithful must acknowledge mathematics eventually. Some of them. Voss looked up at the Golden Throne, at the dying god who'd admitted error. The Emperor supports this. That's what matters. As if in response, the Emperor's presence pulsed acknowledgement approval. Something that might have been satisfaction. Kalis approached his new armor bearing the insignia of Network Protection Detail, a purple-red beacon crossed with a silver sword. Behind him, 20 gray knights in similar armor stood at attention. "Report from Segmentum Obscurus," he said. "The first off-Terra independent network is operational. 50 psychers on Cypra Mundi maintaining a beacon visible across 3 subsectors. Navigators confirm clarity exceeds standard Astronomicon projection." Voss allowed herself a rare smile. Madara would be pleased. Would he, Kalis asked, or would he point out that we're still too slow, still too resistant, still too bound by doctrine? Probably both. Voss turned back to her reports. But he's not here to tell us, which was the point. We have to figure this out ourselves. Are we figuring it out? We're trying. That's all he asked. In the training halls below the palace, Lyra taught a new class of 200 students. Her white hair had been adopted as a symbol by many senior instructors. Some dyed theirs to match others, left it natural, but wore silver thread in solidarity. The girl scheduled to die had become an icon of survival. She stood before nervous young psychers, many of whom still wore inhibitor collars, many of whom still believed they were monsters. 1 year ago, she began, a man from another world walked into this Imperium and called it a prison, called the Emperor a jailer, called us fuel. Gasps from the students. Such words were blasphemy. He was right, Lyra continued. Not because the Emperor is evil, he's not, but because we built a system where the only way to be useful was to die, where power required sacrifice, where helping humanity meant being consumed. She generated chakra silver fire blooming in her palm, steady and controlled. This is the alternative. Power that doesn't consume, contribution that doesn't require death. And the only reason we have it is because someone looked at our system and asked, "Could you do better?" A student raised her hand, barely 14, with eyes that occasionally leaked warp frost. "Is he coming back?" The teacher? "No," Lyra said softly. "He's gone. Forever. Because if he stayed, we'd depend on him. We'd wait for him to solve problems, instead of solving them ourselves. He gave us tools and left us to use them. What if we fail? Then we fail. And we learn. And we try again." Lyra's smile was gentle but firm. That's what being alive means. Not succeeding perfectly, but choosing to keep trying despite risk. She looked at each student. "You are not fuel. You are not monsters. You are people with power learning to use it without being consumed. And that's harder than dying heroically, but it's worth infinitely more." The students stared at her, processing, hoping, choosing slowly to believe. This is what you left us, Lyra thought. The burden of being more than victims, the responsibility of teaching others what you taught us. I hope wherever you are, you're finally at peace, because we're carrying it forward. We're choosing to be human. 3 centuries after departure, the 44th millennium, year 287, post-Madara. The Schola Psychana Primus stood where execution grounds once burned. 3 centuries had transformed the original Skolam into something far greater, a cathedral of learning that rivaled even the greatest temples of the ecclesiarchy. Its spires reached toward Terra's poison sky, each one topped with a beacon chamber where networks of psychers maintained the lights that guided humanity through darkness. Archmagister Lyra Argentis, no longer young but not yet old by rejuvenate standards, stood in the Hall of Remembrance. 300 years of names covered the walls, not executions, graduations. Over 1 million psychers had trained here. Over 900,000 still lived. The mathematics spoke for themselves. She paused before the oldest inscription carved in stone that predated the rest of the hall. 3 names marked with silver: Adept Korin, first of the fallen initiate Marius, second to fall; student Kelia, third to fall. And above them, a quote in archaic script that scholars still debated the origin of. They chose to be more than fuel. That choice, not their power, made them human. The founder. No name, never a name. The Imperium had erased Entity 998 Madara from official records within a decade of his departure. Too dangerous to acknowledge, too heretical to commemorate. But the networks remembered. They always remembered. Lyra placed a hand on Korin's name, a ritual she'd performed every day for 300 years. Some traditions were worth keeping. Still talking to the dead Archmagister, she turned. Interrogator Matthias Voss, grandson of Seraphine. Inheritor of her position, approached with data slates clutched in both hands. Young by inquisitorial standards at only 90, he carried his grandmother's intensity without her cynicism. The dead teach as much as the living, Lyra said. Sometimes more. They don't edit their lessons for political convenience. Matthias smiled slightly. Grandmother said you'd say something like that. She left recordings, you know, for when she finally died. Instructions for me. Stories about the founder that aren't in any official records. Did she tell you he threatened to burn Terra to ash if we gave him a reason? She did. Also said he meant it. Also said she believed him when he promised not to come back. Matthias pulled up a hololithic display. Which brings me to why I'm here. We've detected something. In the warp. And it's complicated. The display showed energy signatures from the network beacons, thousands of them now spanning from Segmentum Solar to the eastern fringe. A web of light that had slowly replaced the Astronomican's burden. Not completely, the Emperor still bore 60% of the load, but enough that he could rest, could think, could be something other than a perpetual sacrifice. But in the display, one signature pulsed differently. Purple-red light, clear and pure, but distant. So distant it barely registered. Segmentum Ultima, Matthias said. 3 months ago, a navigator reported seeing an anomalous beacon during warp transit. Not one of ours, not the Astronomican. Something else, something that felt familiar. Lyra's breath caught. Show me. The hololithic display zoomed, enhanced, focused on a region of space the Imperium barely controlled beyond the Damocles Gulf, past even the Toe Empire's expanding borders. And there, flickering like a distant star, was a beacon that no navigator had ever logged before. It looked exactly like the training beacons from 300 years ago, like the first light Madara had generated when teaching them chakra manipulation. It can't be, Lyra whispered. He left. The agreement was he wouldn't return to Imperial space, Matthias corrected. That beacon is 8,000 light-years beyond our furthest outpost. Technically, he kept his word. Why would he be out there? Don't know, but it gets stranger. Matthias pulled up another display text, ancient, marked with Mechanicus authentication seals. 3 weeks ago, a rogue trader vessel made contact with a remote human colony near that region. The colonists had a legend, a story passed down through generations. He read aloud, "In the darkness between stars, when all seemed lost, a stranger came. Not of the Emperor's light, but of another flame, purple and red like sunset over a world we had forgotten. He taught us to stand when we would have fallen, to fight without being consumed, and when we stood on our own, he walked into the void and became the shadow between stars, watching, always watching, but never returning. They call him the Silent Guardian, the god who refused divinity, the teacher who taught by leaving. And when the night is darkest and the warp screams loudest, some say you can see his eyes in the void, spiraling patterns of purple and red watching over those who choose cooperation over consumption. We do not pray to him. He would hate that. We simply remember the strongest power is what we share with others." Silence fell across the hall of remembrance. Lyra closed her eyes, and for a moment she was 20 again. White hair fresh, burns from pushing too hard still aching, standing before a man with eyes that saw everything and told her she was worth more than dying well. "He's still teaching," she said softly. "Even out there, even 300 years later, still finding people who need to know they're more than fuel." "Should we send a ship?" Matthias asked. "Try to make contact?" "No." Lyra's voice was firm. He made his choice. We make ours. If he's still out there teaching, then we honor that by doing the same here, by proving his methods work, by showing the Imperium that humans can evolve beyond sacrifice. She turned away from the memorial wall toward the younger generation. "Have we evolved, I mean?" Lyra considered. "We're trying." That's all he asked. The Imperial Palace, the Golden Throne Chamber. The Emperor of mankind sat upon his throne, and for the first time in 10,000 years, he was not alone in his thoughts. The burden had lessened. Not disappeared, never disappeared, but lessened. Where once 1,000 psychers burned daily to sustain the Astronomican, now only 400 suffered that fate. The rest had been diverted to the networks, contributing without consuming, living instead of dying. And through those networks, the Emperor could feel them. Millions of minds cooperating, choosing, learning. It was humbling. He had spent 10 millennia believing himself the only one strong enough, wise enough, capable enough, and a stranger from another universe had proven him wrong in 7 days. The Emperor's consciousness drifted through the warp, observing the beacon network, thousands of lights, each one representing people who had chosen cooperation. Each one proof that his old methods, while necessary for their time, were not permanent solutions. And then he felt it, distant, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. A presence in the deep warp, purple-red energy that repelled chaos by its very nature. Moving through regions of space the Imperium had long abandoned. Teaching, always teaching, the Emperor could not smile. His withered body had lost that capacity millennia ago. But his consciousness carried something that might have been approval, perhaps even gratitude. Still at work then. Still finding those who need to learn they are more than their worst fears. The presence didn't respond, couldn't respond. They were too far apart, separated by distances that made communication impossible. But the Emperor understood anyway. I have learned from you, stranger, that gods must eventually step aside, that the greatest gift is not protection, but the tools to protect oneself. I am not yet ready to release my grip entirely, but someday, perhaps. Thank you for showing me that someday is possible. The Emperor withdrew his consciousness, returning focus to the Astronomicon. To the burden, he still bore lighter now than it had been in millennia. And in the deep warp far beyond imperial borders, a presence that had once been Madara Uchiha continued its journey through the void. Segmentum Ultima, the world called Last Hope. The colony was dying when he found it, 3,000 humans stranded on a world at the edge of known space. Their navigator had died, their Geller fields were failing. Demons pressed against reality's skin, hungry for souls that had nowhere to run. They had prayed to the Emperor, screamed for deliverance, received only silence. And then he arrived. Not in a ship, not through the warp, just appearing, as if he'd always been there, standing between them and annihilation. The colonists saw him, pale skin, black hair gone gray, with centuries' eyes that spiraled purple and red with power, that felt wrong and right in equal measure, and thought him a demon. Some raised weapons, others fell to their knees. He raised one hand and purple-red light erupted around the colony. A barrier, a shield. Demons crashed against it and were repelled, not banished. He lacked the strength he'd once had but held at bay. "I'm not here to save you," he said, voice rougher than it had been 3 centuries ago. "I'm here to teach you to save yourselves." He'd given them 7 days. 7 days to learn chakra manipulation, to form networks, to generate their own protective barriers without relying on him to do it for them. Some died, not from failure, from demons that broke through before the network stabilized. Not many. 3. He carved their names into stone before he left, but the rest survived, formed a permanent network that held even after he departed, built beacons that let passing ships navigate toward them, established protocols that let them cooperate without requiring a god to coordinate. And when he left, walking into the void without explanation, without ceremony, they remembered, not as worshippers, as students. "Did we do well?" the colony's leader had asked just before his departure. Madara had looked at the network, crude, inefficient, but stable. Looked at the people, exhausted, traumatized, but alive and cooperating. "You did well enough," he'd said. "The rest is up to you." And then he'd vanished, moving toward the next crisis, the next group of humans who needed to know they were more than fuel for powers they couldn't comprehend. 3 centuries of this. World after world, colony after colony, teaching, always teaching, never staying long enough to be worshipped, never remaining long enough to be needed, because if he stayed, they'd depend on him. And dependence was just another form of slavery. I promised Hashirama I'd learn this lesson. He thought, standing in the warp itself, too far beyond material reality for most beings to survive, sustained only by chakra and stubborn refusal to die again. That the greatest teachers are the ones who make themselves unnecessary. Took me 3 lifetimes, but I think I've got it now." He felt the chaos gods watching. They'd learned to leave him alone. He was too much effort for too little gain. He didn't corrupt, didn't conquer, just taught cooperation and walked away. Boring from their perspective. Infuriating, but boring. Madara smiled slightly. "I've finally become too boring for gods to care about. If that's not enlightenment, I don't know what is." He moved through the warp toward the next distress signal. Another colony, another group of humans who'd prayed and received no answer. Another opportunity to teach people they were stronger together than any of them could be alone. It was endless work. But for the first time in his existence across multiple lives, multiple deaths, multiple universes, it felt right. Not redemption. He'd never be redeemed for the crimes of his past. But purpose, meaning. The knowledge that every person he taught was one less person consumed by systems that saw them as fuel. That's enough, he decided. Not forgiveness, not salvation, but enough. And in the deep warp where time was suggestion and space was joke, Madara Uchiha, who had once dreamed of enslaving a world to save it, continued teaching people how to save themselves. One colony at a time, one network at a time, forever. Terra, the Hall of Remembrance. 5 centuries post-Madara. The Imperium had changed, not overnight, not in dramatic revolution, but slowly, inexorably like erosion wearing down a mountain. The chakra networks now carried 80% of the Astronomican's load. Only 200 psychers per day were consumed by the Golden Throne, still too many, but a fraction of what had been required. And those 200 were volunteers, people who chose sacrifice, not because they were told to, but because they believed in it. Choice made all the difference. The Schola Psychana Primus had expanded across 3 continents, millions trained there, millions more in facilities across 1,000 worlds. The Imperium psychers were no longer fuel to be burned, but citizens to be educated, assets to be cultivated, people to be respected, not everywhere. The old ways persisted in some sectors. The ecclesiarchy still demanded blood in some dioceses, but the tide was turning, slowly, painfully. But turning. Archmagister Theron Lyra's successor, chosen from among the first generation she'd taught, stood before the memorial wall. It had been expanded 16 times. Millions of names now covered kilometers of carved stone. But the oldest names remained at the center: Corin, Marius, Kelia, the first 3 who died choosing to be more than fuel. And above them the quote that every student memorized: "They chose to be more than fuel." That choice, not their power, made them human. The founder. A young psyker, barely 16, fresh from the training halls, approached nervously. "Archmagister, is it true the stories about the founder?" Theron turned. He'd heard this question 1,000 times, would hear it 1,000 more. Which stories? That he wasn't of the Emperor's light, that he came from another world, that he taught us to stand alone and then left forever. The girl's eyes were wide. That he's still out there, teaching others, watching over those who choose cooperation. Theron considered lying. The official record said nothing about Entity 998 Madara. The Inquisition had sealed those files centuries ago. Safer to pretend the founder had been an imperial servant all along. But that would be betraying everything Madara had taught. "It's true," Theron said. "All of it. He came from a world where he'd made terrible mistakes, learned from them, and spent 3 centuries teaching us not to repeat them." "Do you think he'll ever come back?" "No, that was the agreement. We stand alone. We choose for ourselves. He gave us the tools. The rest is up to us." Theron smiled slightly. But sometimes navigators report seeing something in the deep warp. A presence that feels like the old training beacons, like someone still out there teaching. Do you believe them? Theron looked at the memorial wall, at millions of names, at proof that people who chose cooperation survived where those who were forced to sacrifice died. I believe he kept teaching. That's what teachers do even when no one's watching, even when no one remembers. They keep teaching, because the lesson is more important than the credit. The girl thought about this. What was the lesson that you are not fuel, that you are people first, psychers second, that your value is not in dying well, but in living better. Theron placed a hand on her shoulder. That the strongest power is not what you hold alone, but what you share with others. She absorbed this. Then, how do I honor him, the founder? By choosing, by cooperating, by teaching others what you've learned. Theron's voice was gentle. He didn't want statues or prayers. He wanted us to be more than victims, so be more. That's how you honor him. The girl nodded and left. Theron watched her go, then turned back to the wall. 5 centuries. 500 years since a stranger fell from the warp and told the Imperium it could do better. Half a millennium of slow, painful evolution from empire of sacrifice to empire of choice. Was it enough, he wondered? Are we what you hoped we'd become? No answer came, but he hadn't expected one. Teachers taught and walked away. Students proved the lessons by living them. We're trying, he thought. Still trying, still choosing, still learning to stand on our own. I hope that's enough. The Deep Warp, 1,000 years post-Madara. In the spaces between stars where reality surrendered to madness and only the strongest will survived, a presence moved through the darkness. Madara Uchiha, no longer young by any measure even for someone sustained by chakra and stubborn refusal to die, stood in the Imperium itself. His body had long since become more energy than matter. His Rinnegan had evolved into something the Imperium would not recognize, eyes that saw not just into the warp, but through it to the underlying structure of reality itself. He was ancient, powerful, alone, and still teaching. The latest colony was called New Dawn. 40,000 souls stranded when their navigator died and their Geller fields failed. Demons circled like sharks. The colonists screamed prayers that no one answered. Madara appeared, taught them chakra, helped them form networks, held the demons back just long enough for them to learn to do it themselves. 7 days. Always 7 days, the same amount of time he'd been given on Terra. When he left, the colonists tried to thank him, tried to worship him. He stopped them with a single raised hand. "Don't pray to me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 years. "I'm not a god. I'm just someone who learned the hard way that saving people against their will is just another form of tyranny." "Then what should we do?" the colony leader asked. "Live, choose, cooperate, and when others need help, teach them what I taught you." He began to fade, dissolving back into the warp. "That's how you honor what I've shown you, by becoming teachers yourselves." He vanished. The colonists stood in silence. Then slowly they began to teach each other, to refine what he'd shown them, to build something that would last beyond him. Another colony saved. Another group of humans learning to save themselves. Madara moved through the warp, no longer even pretending to have a destination. Just drifting. Watching, intervening when necessary, teaching when possible. 1,000 years since he'd left Terra, 10 centuries of this endless wandering, and in all that time he'd never returned, never broken his promise. Sometimes he wondered if the Imperium had survived, if the network still functioned, if Lyra's teachings had persisted, if humanity had truly learned to stand without gods. He couldn't check. The agreement prohibited it, and even if it didn't, returning would undermine everything he'd taught. They had to stand alone, had to prove they could survive without him. "Do you think they did it?" he asked the ghost of Hashirama, a memory nothing more but one he'd carried across 2 lifetimes and 2 universes. "Did they learn, or did they revert to old patterns the moment I left?" No answer came. Ghosts didn't answer, but Madara smiled anyway, imagining what his old friend would say. "Does it matter? You did what you could. The rest is up to them. Stop trying to control outcomes and just trust that the lessons you taught will take root if they're meant to." Yeah, Madara thought. That sounds like you. Annoyingly wise, even when you're not actually here. He felt the chaos gods watching, They always watched even now, even after a millennium of him ignoring them. Horn's rage, Nurgle's patience, Tzench's schemes, Slaanesh's hunger. They wanted him to fall, to corrupt, to give up on teaching and embrace power. He disappointed them for 1,000 years, would disappoint them for 1,000 more if necessary. I've already been powerful, he thought, already controlled a world, already became a god, and it brought me nothing but regret. This endless teaching, this walking away, this making myself unnecessary, this is what finally feels right. He moved toward the next distress signal. Another colony, another lesson, another chance to teach people they were more than fuel. Forever. That was the price of his redemption. Not forgiveness, he'd never be forgiven, but meaning, purpose, the knowledge that every person he taught was proof that his mistakes hadn't defined him. I will teach until I fade, he promised the universe, until I'm forgotten, until I'm nothing but a legend that no one believes. And I will do it because it's right, not because anyone's watching, not because anyone cares, just because it's right. The warp accepted his vow without comment. It did not care about redemption. Only existence, only power, only survival. But Madara cared. And after 3 lifetimes, that was enough. Terra, the Hall of Remembrance. 2,000 years post-Madara, the Schola Psychona Primus celebrated its 2000th anniversary. The Imperium had changed beyond recognition. The chakra networks now carried 95% of the Astronomican's load. Only 50 psychers per day were consumed by the Golden Throne, and those 50 volunteered, understanding exactly what they were choosing. The Emperor still lived, still guided, but he was no longer alone, no longer drowning under impossible burden. And on quiet days, when the Astronomican hummed its eternal song, some said you could hear him sigh in something like relief. The memorial wall had been moved to its own cathedral, a structure large enough to hold 10 million names. Students, teachers, volunteers who had died in service of the networks, not consumed, not sacrificed against their will, but people who had chosen their fate and accepted the risk. And at the center, carved in stone that had never been replaced, 3 names remained: Adept Corrin, first of the fallen initiate Marius, second to fall, student Kelia, third to fall. And above them, words that every child in the Imperium now learned. They chose to be more than fuel. That choice, not their power, made them human. The founder, High Archmagister Arya, a woman who bore the same name as the first child Madara had saved, though whether through coincidence or honor, no one remembered, stood before the monument. She was old now, even by rejuvenate standards. Nearly 400 years of service. Nearly 400 years of teaching which she'd been taught. A delegation from the Adeptus Terra approached, high lords, inquisitors, even a representative from the Custodes bearing the seal of the Golden Throne. The Emperor wishes to formally acknowledge the founder's contribution, the custodian said, his voice carrying absolute authority. To posthumously grant him every honor the Imperium can bestow, to inscribe his true name in the records, to declare this system his legacy. Arya looked at them for a long moment. Then she laughed, not mockingly, but with understanding. You want to own him, to claim his teachings as imperial doctrine, to make him yours. She shook her head. He would have hated that. He saved billions. He taught billions to save themselves. There's a difference. Arya turned to face the High Lords. The moment you inscribe his name in official records, you turn him into a saint, into another thing people pray to instead of learning from. That's exactly what he didn't want. Then what do we do? How do we honor him? Arya gestured at the cathedral around them, at the memorial wall holding 10 million names, at the thousands of students training in chambers below, at the networks humming across a galaxy, proving every day that cooperation worked. We do this, we keep teaching. We keep choosing cooperation over consumption. We keep making ourselves unnecessary so others can stand on their own. She smiled. That's how we honor him, by becoming teachers who walk away, by giving people tools and trusting them to use those tools wisely. That's all. That's everything. The delegation departed unsatisfied. They'd wanted monuments, statues, formal recognition. They'd gotten a philosophy professor telling them the best way to honor someone was to make their method so normal that no one remembered they'd once been revolutionary. But Arya knew that was exactly right. The founder, whoever he'd been, whatever his true name, hadn't wanted to be remembered as a savior. He'd wanted to be forgotten, to have his teachings become so natural, so integral that no one thought about them anymore. To become invisible because his lessons were so deeply embedded in society that they were just how things were done. We're getting there, she thought. In another 1,000 years, maybe no one will remember there was ever another way. Maybe Psychers being people first will be so obvious that no one questions it. Maybe that's when you can finally rest. She looked up at the stars through the cathedral's transparent dome. Somewhere out there in the deep warp, some navigators still reported seeing something. A presence, purple-red energy that moved between stars, teaching. Are you still out there, she wondered. Still teaching, still wandering. I hope so. I hope you found what you were looking for. I hope. Her thought was interrupted by a student barely 10 years old, with eyes that glowed faintly blue, approaching nervously. Archmagister, I was told to ask you about the founder, for my history project. Arya knelt to the child's level. What do you want to know? Was he real or just a story? What do you think? The child considered. I think it doesn't matter. Real or story, the lesson is the same. That we're people first, that we choose, that we're strongest together. Arya smiled. Then you've already learned everything important. The child ran off. Arya stood watching her go. Yes, she thought. We're getting there. When children learn the lesson without knowing the teacher's name, that's when we've truly succeeded. That's when he can finally be forgotten. And I think he'd want nothing more. The end of all things, beyond time. In the deep warp where past and future blurred together, where causality was suggestion and reality was negotiable, a presence older than empires moved through the darkness, Madara Uchiha. If that name still applied to something that had transcended flesh millennia ago, had become something the Imperium would not recognize. Not human, not demon, something between, something other, a teacher who had taught so long he'd forgotten how to be anything else. He had lost count of the colonies saved, the networks established, the people taught. Numbers ceased to matter after the first millennium, after the 10th, after the 100th. He had simply continued, teaching, always teaching, moving through the warp like a ghost manifesting when needed, disappearing when his students could stand alone. Never staying, never accepting worship, never allowing dependence, and in doing so, he had become what he'd once feared most irrelevant. His methods had spread so far, been refined so many times that they no longer needed him. Entire sectors of the galaxy now practiced chakra manipulation without knowing where it came from. Networks formed spontaneously. Teachers taught teachers who taught teachers. The system had become self-sustaining. Which means I succeeded, he thought. And success means I'm no longer necessary. It was a strange feeling. Liberation and loneliness combined. The knowledge that he'd achieved exactly what he'd set out to do, make himself obsolete, came with the understanding that obsolescence meant purposelessness. What do I do now, he wondered, when there's no one left to teach, when everyone already knows? For the first time in millennia, Madara stopped moving. Just stopped. Floating in the warp surrounded by chaos that no longer frightened him, considering a question he'd never thought to ask. What comes after redemption? He had no answer. And then from somewhere in the warp that should not have been possible, he heard a voice. Familiar. Impossible. But undeniable. Rest, old friend. You've done enough. Hashirama. Not a ghost, not a memory, something else. An echo from across dimensions, across universes, carried through the warp by sheer force of bond that transcended death itself. You were right, Madara whispered into the void. About everything. About trust, about letting go, about people being stronger together than any god alone. I know, I'm always right. Incredibly annoying, isn't it? Madara laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in centuries. So what now? I've taught everyone who needs teaching. I've made myself unnecessary. I've achieved irrelevance. What do I do with that? You rest, you let go, you trust that what you've built will stand without you, and you finally allow yourself to stop. I don't know how. Yes, you do. You've been teaching it for 2,000 years. Now teach it to yourself. The voice faded, but its message remained. Madara floated in the warp, considering. Then, for the first time in multiple lifetimes, he made a choice not to act. He let his form dissipate, let his consciousness spread, let himself dissolve into the background radiation of the universe, becoming less a person and more a presence, a memory, an echo. The strongest power is what we share, he thought, as he faded. So I'll share one last lesson: how to let go. How to trust that what you've built will survive without you. How to finally rest. His consciousness fragmented, spread, became less an individual and more a concept. The idea that cooperation was possible, that people could learn to save themselves, that gods were unnecessary if humans chose to stand together. And as he faded, the warp itself seemed to sigh in something like approval. The chaos gods watching felt something they had never experienced before: loss, not defeat, not banishment, but the loss of an eternal opponent, someone who had resisted them for 2,000 years, not through power, but through persistent, stubborn teaching of a principle they could never corrupt, that people who chose each other would always be stronger than gods who stood alone. And now he was gone. Not dead. You couldn't kill something that had become an idea, but gone. Dissolved, spread so thin across the universe that he was no longer a presence, but a whisper, a shadow between stars, a half-remembered lesson that no one could quite source, a feeling that when you chose cooperation, something in the universe approved. That was Madara's final form. Not a god, not a hero, not even a teacher. Just a reminder that people who work together could achieve what no individual ever could. And in the Imperium of the 44th millennium, that reminder had become so common, so natural, so integrated into daily life that no one questioned it anymore, which meant he had finally truly succeeded by becoming forgotten. In a remote corner of Terra, far from the Schola Sicana, Primus, far from the cathedrals and monuments, there stood a simple stone. No inscription, no name, just a stone, and on it carved so faintly that only those who knew to look could find it. Here stood someone who learned too late that saving people meant letting them save themselves. May you learn faster than I did. No one knew who'd placed it, no records existed, but every few years someone would find it, would read the inscription, would wonder, and sometimes, very rarely, they'd smile and think, yes, that's exactly right. And then they'd walk away, ready to teach that lesson to others, ready to become unnecessary themselves, ready to trust that the strongest power was not what they held alone, but what they shared with everyone. That was Madara's true legacy, not monuments or names or formal recognition. Just an idea so simple and so revolutionary that it had taken an empire 10,000 years to learn it. That people who choose each other will always outlast gods who stand alone. And in the 44th millennium, that idea had become more powerful than any weapon, any army, any deity, because it was true. And truth once learned could never be unlearned.